Okay, so welcome back to Pixitron and Papi, the Pixie game that we're making. We'll get a name for it eventually, but I wanted to follow up with the video that I posted earlier to fill in a couple of gaps that I realized afterwards. So if you did everything that was in the last video, you wouldn't have been able to see the actual site work. If I go to Lost Astronaut, oh, that's a locked thing. If you go to Lost Astronaut and then you go to Pixigame, it's not going to work. It did say no API keys, but for a couple of little realities. So I already happen to have a Papi DB without the name change. In the beginning of the last video, I changed the name of the database, but I didn't change the settings. So there's a folder here. Under Pixigame called settings, and in it you have the database config, some enumerators, some flags. We'll talk about those if they ever become important, and then a general config. You don't really have to change anything in config, but while we're in here, we're just gonna change the pepper to something. Actually, I'm not going to change the pepper in front of everybody, but you should change these values. So there's lorem barfing goatso ipsum. You got to change that. The form salt should be changed. And then you can just look through here and decide if you need to change anything else. You can change your domain and host. That's for links that are generated, but in Papi there isn't that. And then you have your app ID, which has to be given to your client. And this admin token thing, just change it to something that the client's not going to know. We're probably not going to use this feature because it's a security concern and it's not necessary if you have access to the MySQL. But if you did want to make an admin section, you would want to have a token that no one else knows. So you got to change these values: the pepper, the form salt, the app ID, and the token. You can just come up with one. It doesn't have to be generated. You could generate one through a password generator or something like that if you wanted. You can also change your domain and your site information, but this is all set up so that it will work the way it is. Papi's really minimal, so you don't really need all that much of a feature in that area. Actually, I'm going to delete this. Delete these comments. They refer to a project that had nothing to do with that. So probably should remove that from the Papi repo, but it's no big deal that they're there. Okay, so the auth timeout. This is milliseconds. So 1,000 milliseconds times 60 seconds times 30 minutes. So that's the auth timeout. You might want to change the last number, make it 1 minute, 5 minutes. The timeout for the cookie is set to a number of seconds equal to the auth timeout. So you want to make them both the same value. So 5 minutes or something like that. 30 is just a little excessive. I will change that value while I'm in here. 5 minutes is pretty good, but you don't, whatever you think is best. So you change that to 5 minutes. So then the other thing you have to do in the settings folder, is edit the config.databases, and there's going to be a part of this that's blurred out, and that's my. Actually, I don't have the. I don't have my. You would put like root or your MySQL username, and instead of PapiDB, you would put in pixigame.db. And I'm going to change the password as well. I'm not going to change it in front of you, but I will change it now for my system. So that's the config.databases.php file in the settings folder. And it's only after that that it's really connected to the database. A couple other things you should do. If you know anything about PHP or websites, you want to look at the auth. just take a look at it. This is where your settings for the DB and the username and password are. You don't have to change the settings here, but just understand that the auth comes in and it does some stuff and checks the API keys. So it's basically instantiating the auth model, which is in the model folder. Or actually, I'm sorry, it's a shred. So auth is not itself. I had written it before where auth was its own, table and database and stuff like that. It was separate to a user, but I've actually changed it now. Auth is not a model. It's just a class that gets instantiated and it has all the logic in there. So you can see here, we talked before about the headers and the databases and stuff like that. And in certain configurations, maybe you want a separate database for the auth. We had that set up before once in a project. But this is where we're checking the API keys. So every single request is going to have this called on it. It's going to look at the headers and see what the request was asking for. And if you don't want to use, this is where you could change the names of the headers. So if you didn't want to call it Papi, if you wanted to call it pixigame, you could do that here and then also on the back end so that those are lined up, or you could break them out into a config file if you wanted to, and then use that global define to set those everywhere. But regardless, this is where we're doing, so the auth database and the database are pretty much the same in this configuration. So I'm just going to add the database global. And I don't know if I have to add it there or not, but yeah, so actually I don't have to add it there. That's my bad. So I'm not changing anything in there. I was just taking a look at that with you briefly. So shreds auth is where the authentication occurs. And it's called in core. So if you go into core auth, it's going to be including the model. And here you have the auth database, and that just happens to be the same. So you'll see here, actually, that the database is the auth database. But if you wanted to, you could split off of it here. So the idea here is that you could have separate auth databases. I don't know. It was necessary at one point, but I don't need to do that now, so it's not set up. And you'll see here it's doing the logging based on the plug level, which you set prior to including core. So if you go into page.php, you're going to see that it includes everything, including path, and then it ends with the include of auth. It also does including of entire folders, those folders being model, global, shreds, and UI. And all of the config files are included here. So that's how all the files get brought together. And yeah, you could move these around or whatever, but it's not really necessary to do that. You sort of already have that set up. And the way that you add new endpoints. So an endpoint is, anywhere on the web that you want people to be able to go. The idea here is that you would just create a new file. There's an index, of course. So all you'd have to do is go to the directory name, and you can do it all in index, and you could have index including other files, and those files could be stored in, for instance, the engines folder, or you can make a new folder and put them in there, but not the shreds folder, not the model folder, I believe not the global folder, and maybe it's engines, but I think there's one other folder. It could be engines. That or modules. One of these, maybe modules, is where you want to stick stuff that you're going to load. Yeah, I think that's how it works. So these are just folders, and some of them happen to be included all inside of the page.php. So that's all taken care of for you there. Yeah. So there's also this automation folder, and you can actually move that out of there if you want. It's basically got two files in it. One of them is model maker, and I just have this here because sometimes you need to create a whole bunch of models at once. So you just change the values in this array, you run it, and it will paste out to you a bunch of, or it'll create a bunch of files in the model folder. Now you got to be careful because it will overwrite, but or actually I guess it won't because it's checking to see if it exists. But essentially this just creates empty model files with the single class like I showed you in the previous video. It just does that for a table, so you have a place to start. Which brings me to the model folder. So you remember last time we created the game model, and you'll remember that there was some settings, and there's some, not settings, but columns in here, like last state users. Inside of this class is where we're going to instantiate all of the useful helpers that are going to, figure out, like, get me the user list for this number of game, and it's going to just break that out for you. Or when you take this out of the database, it's not quite in the format you need. So you would have a method in here that converts it into the usable format, because it seems like you can pack things into a database and you can unpack them from a database. You can probably put save and load in here, maybe add player, set turn, start game, things that can be called from an action in the index.php. So your index is basically there to, validate the incoming request. And, one of them is going to be create new game, and create new game is going to call, use that model game to make some changes, just like we use the shred class auth here, or the user model here. Here we're, it's just a user find by email. It's just a way that I can get back quickly any user that is found by email. And if false or null is true on user, then we didn't get a user back. So that's a good example that I can show you. So if you go to model user, find by email, it grabs the global auth database because it's a user-based thing. And it just, uses the user model to search for the first that matches an email. So where does this first come from? Is that something you wrote in user? No, it's actually in model. And the place that model is if you go into code/pdo /model. I think it's, no, maybe it's just, I'm sorry, core, not code, core/pdo /model. Here you have a couple of helper classes, and then model, which contains, table, which gives you the table name, which usually is the class name. Errors, last, to get information about the last query that you ran through, including the last ID. Insert, create, join. So create, you're expected to pass it an array that is indexed by the value that you want to set, and then that index, and then the value is set for that element. So for instance, for user, or for game, it would be like $ data would equal array, where our users equaled, and then a list of users, just like we described in the database. I'll be demonstrating this in more detail later, but I just wanted to fill you in that there is more to read here. It's always good to look at the code to understand it, but you can indeed create a new, so create for a model creates a new row or entry into the database table. Join will do a table A, table B join, usually an inner join, but you can program any sort of join into there. Select, and it's all done pretty smartly, pretty minimally. You don't have to fill out everything if you're careful. Between, gives you back an inclusive set. Select between, select where between. There's a lot of arbitrary stuff. By, I use this a lot, by. Field, value, order by, prepared. So this gives you back a list. Again, it's all array based, so it's giving you back arrays of row information that are usually arrays themselves. And here we finally find first. So when I said first email and then I gave it a value, if the value was null or if I didn't provide a value, it would just grab everything it could, but it would give you only one, right? And you can set in the order by clause, you can set the order by value. So the way that works is you have to say like order by ID, which would order it by the ID, or order by created, which is why we're storing timestamps as integers so that we can order things by their date. And first is only going to give you the first one. All will give you every row in the table. And then there's get by ID, so it's just get and then a number. So if you knew that user 6 was your user, you could say get, 6, or more commonly it would be get $user open bracket ID, in quotes, so that you're passing in a user's ID that you already knew. As object, I don't really use that often, but it just converts it to a data object instead of being an array. But I don't really use that. Maybe there's some plugin or PHP library that you would want to use where it needed to be more like that, or just some situation where that would be better. Set is a very useful one. I think you'll use by, first, and set probably the most, as well as create. So set allows you to set for an ID some data, and you pass it in an array of those new settings, and it will overwrite whatever's in the database. So if you want to change a user's name, you would pass in data where username was set equal to some new username, like Bill, Bob, Joe, something like that. Then there's toggle. Toggle will turn on and off an ID or a key or a flag. This is specifically for integers where you have bit vector, and a bit vector is when you have the bits, you're flipping the bits in the actual integer. You have 32 bits, for instance, in an integer, and you wanted to flip some of them so that you could use them as kind of like an array of Boolean values. It's just a way to save some time. You can also do searches for keys that are set into a thing that way. So a little advanced there, but basically toggle allows you to toggle flags inside of a key that just is literally a column in a database that is an integer that you're going to be using flags for. You should look that up. It's powers of 2. It's a bit vector. All right, so then there's on and off. These will flip on and flip off keys, so you can toggle them. So if they are on, they'll go off. If they're off, they'll go on. Or you can use on to turn them on and make sure they're on, and off to turn them off and make sure they're off. So you're saying, I want that off. I want that on. Or I want to toggle that. So update is sort of like an open-ended version of set, where you're going to pass it the same sort of data you would pass into set, but you can write your own custom where clause. And if you don't know SQL, you're going to have to look up what insert, update, and create do. They're very complicated functions, but these are broken down to the most simplest form. So you're able to use this object, which is every model that you have, to make changes to the database. Every model actually gets a copy of its database when it's created. So from that global variable, we do install that into the actual class for the model. So it can be self-referential, or you can pass in a database and then pass that database into a model and change the model. There's duplicate, which will duplicate a specific field and return the value that's been inserted. So insert returns the new ID of the thing that's been inserted, which is normally what you need. And then execute, which just runs a query on the database. So, that's essentially how model works. That's the only class in here you need to really know. And as I was saying, the only things you really need to remember are create, set, perhaps insert. Insert and create are very similar. In fact, create calls insert, but you need to understand how those work, and then You might need to select things. You might need to, first, by, all. It's all like that. It's just selecting, filtering, quick and easy. Okay, so obviously any model is going to be based or extend off that model class, and that's basically the nutshell of where we're going to go next. So we've created a game object that describes games in a table, and now we have to write the logic around the storage, retrieval, and all of the operations onto and with the game object. And we're probably going to have a couple of other things, but remember, we simplified the use of the database by using last state and turn count. Pretty much all the data can be stored in a game. Maybe you want to store some data on the player as well, like did they win? If so, did they get some sort of a score? So that's something we're going to have to get to as well. And there's maybe the concept of a player. Is the user a player, or is the user just an account that creates a player persona? Something you're going to have to think about. If you did it that way, your username would have to be unique, but the player could not be unique. So there could be 15, Joe Smith players, and that's fine too. But we're not going to be making any UIs on this end of things. All of the UI and all of the data is going to be passed into the client. The client will do most of the display of that. It'll just be, and the client will do some validation. Can you move there? And it has to do that validation because it needs to tell you can't. On the other hand, the server has to also be able to validate that to avoid cheating. So that way nobody can write a bot that mimics the client, which is possible, and then cheats. So I think what's great about this project is that we're going to be making a game that should be cheat proof if it's done properly. Well, thanks so much for listening. This was a shorter video, but I just wanted to get a few concepts out there, something to think about. And in the next video, I'll probably start doing a little bit more with the game model, and then I will be doing a little bit in the actual engine. So retrieving it, perhaps logging in, things like that. Certainly logging in. Take care. And if you like this video, please thumb it up, hit the subscribe button, bell, whatever. Have a good one.